All right, well, thank you for those songs. We will be turning to Exodus chapter 18. We are continuing our study through the book of Exodus. So this is now message number 22, entitled Jethro's Praise. We'll be looking at chapter 18. I'm going to read verses 1 to 7 as we get started. When Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her two sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land, and the name of the other was Eleazar, for the God of my father, said he, was mine help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness, where he encamped at the mount of God. And he said unto Moses, I, thy father-in-law, Jethro, am come unto thee, and thy wife and her two sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and did obeisance, and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. So chapter 17 continues the series of wilderness stories that feature problems for Israel and their unfaithful responses. And it's a part of a cycle of complaining stories, really, that runs beginning in chapter 14 all the way through chapter 17 in particular, though we could probably add chapter 18 to it in a way. But to label them as complaining stories or murmuring stories or what have you might cause us to miss the point that these are really stories of God's care, God's provision of the people of Israel, His deliverance of them, His protection of them, and ongoing presence with them. Now, God's response to this complaining and grumbling in the wilderness is to provide their needs and also to give them His words. He gives them His commands that they are to follow. And really, this cycle, this pattern that we see to this point, and really by this point, complaining stories sort of have become a story type by this point, because they certainly follow a certain pattern and structure. But really, this doesn't change in far as the way God responds until after the golden calf incident. After the golden calf incident, which we're still not to yet, but after that incident, he responds to Israel's complaining a bit differently than what he does before. Now, complaint is certainly a feature of these accounts, and it's be hard to miss, and you don't want to miss it. But the whole experience of Israel in the wilderness is really one of their murmuring and grumbling. And we can see complaints in these accounts for the ugly sin that it truly is. It complaining and murmuring, as is described of Israel in these accounts, shows how that they are ignoring or they are neglecting what is good, what God has done, and especially what God has already revealed. So it reveals an ungratefulness, ingratitude for what God has done, a failure to trust in Him, though He has made Himself known to Israel already by this point, and again in a way unprecedented. And it also sets a person up as being a judge over God. In other words, determining what God ought to do and what God ought not to do, and whether He's right or good to do this or to do that. And it judges God and His will, and probably at worst accuses God as though He hasn't kept His word, or as though He is somehow not acted as He should. So reading these accounts certainly should give us some sense of warning. In other words, some sense of application to us in our day, in our circumstances. But that doesn't mean that we are one-to-one equal with Israel in this sense. But it is a part of God's revelation. And Paul wrote that these things that happen unto them are examples for us to learn from so that we don't sin against God through lust and complaint the way that they did. So just a glance at that real quick in 1 Corinthians chapter number 10, Paul writing to a predominantly Gentile church in the city of Corinth wrote, "Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happened unto them for ensamples or examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world, the ends of the age are come. Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. There hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it." So you can see Paul is referring to this incident in chapter 17, as well as other incidents in their history, as well as their failures and their sins, complaining, being among those, and says these are plainly written to give us an admonition that we don't sin in that way that they sin. So again, we don't want to miss that particular message. Chapter 17 also introduced us to the first warfare for Israel as a nation. They have enemy nations to contend with, and in fact, that continues and will continue until the return of Christ. Now, this is an important theme, not only in God's full will for Israel, but for the nations as well, which he'll begin to make known, particularly, or he began to make known rather, particularly through his promises and his covenant with Abraham. Well, Israel's first victory also comes in chapter 17 in such a way that dependence on the Lord for that victory was emphasized. Remember, as you read that account in chapter 17, all of this attention that is given to Moses up on that hill, and Aaron and Hur that are with him, that eventually they have to hold up his hands, and all of this to last throughout the time until the battle is over, and Joshua and Israel have been victorious. And so again, there are lessons here for us as well. I mean, we want to understand what this original context and meaning and all of that intention is, but also understand how these things are examples for us to learn from as well. Well, oftentimes we are so concerned with fighting that battle in the field, and that's a daunting task. You have to take up the sword, and you have to go and you have to engage with the enemy on the field of battle. You have to shed blood, and your blood is probably going to be shed. So there is a real work there that has to be done. But oftentimes we are so focused on the doing of that, the fighting of the battle, that we don't think about the fact that the battle is really won or lost up on that hill. And the way that the language that is used with the lifting up of the hands is actually language that's indicative of prayer. It's as if Moses was up there praying. He's lifting up his hands. Aaron and Hur are helping him. And so, really, there is a spiritual battle, or there is a spiritual ground where the real battle takes place. And out on the field, it's just simply the results. It's just simply the consequences. It doesn't mean that we don't have to have the faith of Joshua to take up the sword and go. But we also have to understand that we have to have the faith of Moses to understand where that real battle is fought and won. Well, now we've come to chapter 18, and chapter 18 is the last part of this subsection of Israel's journey from Egypt to Sinai, and they're in the wilderness during this time, and they're very close to Sinai. They're still here at Rephidim, and they haven't quite made it to Sinai yet, but they're very close. And when you read chapter 18, it might almost seem like a strange bit to throw in here, but it actually contributes to the whole account and certain important themes, particularly here as well as in other places throughout the Pentateuch as well. So Jethro comes to Moses with Moses' wife and sons, and they are reunited here. And there's an important development among the nation of Israel in this chapter before they get to Sinai. So we're going to look at this in two parts. So in verses 1 to 12, is where Jethro comes to Moses and he gives an account to his father-in-law of all the things that God has done. And then in verses 13 to 27, we get this part about Moses judging Israel and, again, that development of Israel as a nation. So let's start with the first part again. Let's look at verses 1 to 7. When Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her two sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land. And the name of the other was Eleazar, for the God of my father, said he, was mine help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and with his wife unto Moses into the wilderness, where he encamped at the mount of God. And he said unto Moses, I, thy father-in-law Jethro, am come unto thee, and thy wife and her two sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and did obeisance and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. So Jethro is here sort of reintroduced into the account, to the priest of Midian, the father-in-law of Moses. And we're told that he had heard the report of all that God had done. So before you just jump over that and go on, think about what that means, that Jethro in Midian had heard about all that God had done. You know, there's not quick and easy communication at this time, obviously. So what does that mean? That means that the word of what the God of Israel had done was out among the nations, so that what he had done was being known, just as he had said to Pharaoh all the way back in chapter 9 and verse number 16, that he had raised Pharaoh up for the purpose that his name would be made great among all the nations of the earth. So presumably, Moses had sent Zipporah and his sons back to stay with Jethro. This would have been after the circumcision incident back in chapter 4, before he went to Egypt. He was on the way. And we're told here that they were encamped at Horeb, which means they were near to Sinai. They're in the region of Sinai. And it's identified as Rephidim in the previous chapter. But again, the exact location is not known with any certainty. And so his father-in-law comes to him, and we get this formal greeting and exchange sort of between them. And obviously there's a reunion there of Moses and his family. And then we get to the meat of this part, verses 8 to 12. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So Moses has met his father-in-law, and he gives him a full account of everything that had happened. And notice how it's put there, that it's all that he had done to the Egyptians. And again, in that part of the account, we noticed how passive that Israel was really for most of it, that most of these things were just happening and they didn't really have anything to do, except, of course, when it comes to Passover and some instances like that. But also, he said, all the travail that had fallen upon them since they had left Egypt. And they certainly have had a lot of difficulties that they have encountered. And then we see the response that Jethro makes to this full account. And the Bible tells us that he rejoiced for all the goodness of the Lord and what he had done to Israel and delivering them from the hand of the Egyptians. Now, set that over against what we have read repeatedly of the murmuring and the grumbling and the complaining of Israel as they have been in the wilderness and they have been enduring these difficulties and these afflictions. And again, you see just how short-sighted. They weren't rejoicing. They weren't rejoicing at all that God had done. But Jethro hears this account and he rejoices and praises the Lord for his goodness in doing all of these things that he has done. Now, God's goodness to Israel and Jethro's rejoicing at it actually is a foreshadowing of the future rejoicing of the nations for God's fulfillment of all his promises to Israel through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jethro praises the Lord and declares that Yahweh is greater than all gods. He says, I know this. In other words, in response to what God has done, Jethro is declaring that God has made known that he is greater than all gods. Now, this is obviously a recurring theme. God saying things like he would do this and that action so that his name would be made known and that there would none like him in the earth and those sort of things. So back in chapter 5 and verse 2 and chapter 6 and verse 7, chapter 7, verse 5, chapter 8 and verse 10, chapter 9 and verse 29. So again, this has been a recurring theme of Yahweh greater than all gods of the earth. But think about for a moment what is happening here as Abraham Moses rather has given all of this account to Jethro, and Jethro has responded in the way that he has. What's happening? Well, first of all, Jethro is a Midianite. He's a man of a non-Israelite nation, the nation of Midian. And so technically speaking, he is a Gentile. He's Goy. He praises God for his goodness to Israel. So we have a man of the nations praising God for his goodness to Israel, that nation that he has chosen from Abraham. And so this rejoicing and this praise and this declaration coming from a Gentile, coming from a man of the nations, shows the accomplishing of God's purpose that he be made known among all the nations of the earth. And again, back to places like Exodus chapter 9 and verse 6. But it also foreshadows, looks forward to that new Exodus when Shiloh gathers the nation of Israel, and his name is praised as great among all the nations of the earth, according to Jacob's prophecy in Genesis chapter 49 and verse number 10, and also still looked at in the future in Malachi chapter 1 and verse number 11. And that date is still future to us, just as Steve was in the Sunday school this morning, so we don't know that day, when that day is going to come, but that day has been promised and it is going to come. Well, Jethro here is really functioning like a sign or a token of the nations being blessed through Abraham and Israel, according to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3 and many other passages that we've considered. So just as Egypt and Amalek were of the curses of the nations, of those who curse Israel, Jethro is of the blessing of the nations that comes through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and that nation from them. Now we get to the next part of this chapter, which is the larger portion and speaks of Moses judging Israel. So let's begin here with verses 13 to 18. And it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from the morning unto the evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did to the people, he said, What is this thing that thou doest to the people? Why sittest thou thyself alone, and all the people stand by thee from morning unto even? And Moses said unto his father-in-law, Because the people come unto me to inquire of God. When they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and his laws. And Moses' father-in-law said unto him, The thing that thou doest is not good. Thou wilt surely wear away both thou and this people that is with thee, for this thing is too heavy for thee. Thou art not able to perform it thyself alone. Now, judging the people that's referred to involves the hearing of the various cases among them and rendering decisions, as well as giving and teaching them commands and statutes and how that they apply in the situation and so on. And they came to Moses because he is the mouth of God to the people. And Moses said that. They come to me because they come to me to inquire of God. They don't ask God directly and God answer them. God spoke to Moses, and he spoke to Moses face to face. And so Moses is working with revelation that God has already given and revelation that God is continuing to give as he progressively makes his revelation known. And at this point, through his chosen instrument or mouthpiece, Moses. So the people came to Moses to inquire of God. Now you have to also remember that they had not fully received the Old Covenant law yet. That will begin at Sinai and will sort of unfold over quite a bit of time for them to receive all of that. And in other words, the people were not coming to Moses to seek advice. They weren't coming to just, hey, let me run something by you. They were coming to Moses for authoritative judgment concerning their cases. They were coming to, as he said, to inquire of God. So these cases would have involved various things like personal strives, issues. There's always property issues and whatever, and more personal property in this sense. They weren't in the land yet, but questions of obligation in certain situations and settling of arguments and all kinds of things that these cases would have involved. And so this actually brings us now to that last need of Israel that's highlighted in this subsection. There were 4 of them in total, and this is the 4th one. And this one shows that internal strife is something that could easily threaten Israel and could easily cause a separation of the tribes. Now, they have already at this point been sort of ordered in their tribes, and we know that the camp gets set up and arranged in all these sort of ways. So they're already functioning sort of as smaller nations, as it were, within a nation. And so the idea of personal strife and within a tribe or between tribes, it could easily cause a separation. And we already saw in Genesis how that some of that strife caused a separation between Abraham and Lot. We will see later how it ultimately does cause a separation between the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes and the 2, because of some differences and strife there. So this shows us, though, once again, that's not their greatest threat, and it's not their greatest need. And you get to the answer to that, obviously, as you get on through the Pentateuch, and particularly to Deuteronomy, and the need was within their heart. So Jethro here acknowledges to Moses that there's a logistical problem with this arrangement. In other words, he's not making suggestion that Moses has sinned in something that he's doing. So there's not a particular instruction that Moses is following in terms of the exact arrangement as it was, but it's more of a logistic problem, and it's also a somewhat short-sighted problem because what happens after Moses and so on. And we're talking about a nation that's being developed and is being arranged and established as a nation obviously with their own governance. So he's not rebuking Moses for being disobedient, but he's simply pointing out the logistical problem, and he's giving Moses an alternative to consider. Verses 19 to 23. Hearken now unto my voice, I will give thee counsel, and God shall be with thee. Be thou for the people to Godward, that thou mayest bring the causes unto God. And thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws, and shalt show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work that they must do. Moreover, thou shalt provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, and rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And let them judge the people at all seasons. And it shall be that every great matter they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter they shall judge. So shall it be easier for thyself, and they shall bear the burden with thee. If thou shalt do this thing, and God command thee so, then thou shalt be able to endure, and all his people shall also go to their place in peace. So essentially, Jethro counsels Moses to establish a system of judgment as well as a system of teaching, a system that's going to instruct the people concerning the law and the statutes, those things that God has revealed. And he's saying both of this is going to be necessary. And in other words, the intention is that everyone should know, everyone should be informed, they should be taught the Word of God, and in so doing, some of these problems are going to take care of themselves. If the people know the Word of God and know what they ought to do and should do, then they don't have to run to Moses and ask Moses, well, what should I do? No, this is the Word of God. So they had to be taught the Word of God, and that I think ultimately was reflected later in the synagogue system and whatnot that was developed. But even before that, with the prophets and the prophet schools and the things that they had, there was a lot of teaching function that took place there later within Israel. And then secondly, he suggested that there be an arrangement of a system of judgment so that there would be sort of a hierarchy. It'd be some organization from lesser to greater. And this is obviously a very important step governmentally and organizationally for this new nation of Israel. And ultimately, this system of judgment became the Sanhedrin much, much later. But Moses, first of all, must find qualified and capable men. And he gives him some things to consider there. And you see that term, able men. They must be capable. In other words, Jethro's not advising Moses to make honorary appointments. Well, old Jed's just been with us so long, we might as well promote him and make him this or make him that. No, you find able and competent men. And the qualified part of it has to do with those various aspects of character. They fear God. They're men of truth. They're truthful, trustworthy men. They hate covetousness. They're not susceptible to bribes. They're not looking to get ahead and all of that sort of thing. And to arrange them as rulers, he says, over thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. And what he's talking about is obviously arrangement according to the tribes, and then down to the family level. And so they would be able to judge in many cases. And he organizes them sort of into lesser and greater courts. And I think this is even somewhat reflective in even in our present day with the appellate court system and all of that, you have lower courts all the way up to the Supreme Court, as it were. And essentially here Moses functions as that Supreme Court under this particular system. He's the one that received revelation from God. It's not that all of these judges would receive revelation from God, but they must learn the revelation that God's already given. And then they can, in turn, teach that to the people. And then they, in turn, can judge according to that word that they have received. And then, if something is beyond that, well, then they can bring that to Moses because he's the one that talks to God. And he's the one that can receive revelation and command, instruction for whatever that case may be. Now, Jethro made this recommendation to Moses. He made this recommendation from faith. In other words, there's no indication whatsoever that Jethro has received some sort of revelation to bring this to Moses. But rather, how did Jethro arrive? Well, he obviously seemed to have a high position among the Midianites. He had seemed to have some experience at that sort of level. But even more so than that, what we read in the first part of the chapter shows us how that Jethro was able to make inference from what God had already made known. He was able to rejoice in all of God's goodness and all that God had done. And he says, now I know that God is greater than the gods. In other words, he was able to look at what God had done, to hear his words, and he was able to make those proper inferences. So he had not received revelation, but had inferred through the making of through God making himself known, and essentially counseled Moses in this governmental, as it were, arrangement. And in the last part of the chapter, verses 24 to 27, so Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And they judged the people at all seasons. The hard causes they brought unto Moses, but every small matter they judged themselves. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way into his own land. So Moses, and we're not told all of the ins and the outs of this, but at the very least, Moses obviously saw the wisdom in what Jethro was suggesting, and it must have, at the very least, must have been consistent with the revelation that God had made. Whether he, again, how all of that worked out, we're really not told, because this right here at the end is, as you read it, you can tell it's just sort of a summary, and you get those summaries every so often in these historical type books, especially. It's just sort of a summary of the outcome or the result of this. And so Moses did and ended up doing as Jethro had said. And then we get reference to Moses letting his father-in-law depart and him going to his own land. And again, this is a summary, and it doesn't seem that Jethro left necessarily immediately. I believe there is reference to him being with Moses after this particular time in the chronology of the story. But he did ultimately depart to go back to his own land and continue his own life and duties there. So when we think about this account and the structure of this account, and that structure is important, and it's something that a lot of times we don't think about. We just read through and we recognize this and that, but there really is a structure. There are some very obvious parallels in this account to two other accounts. So the first one would be the previous chapter. In the previous chapter and the coming of Amalek. And so you have a contrast here between the coming of Amalek. What did they do? Well, Amalek came to exploit Israel. Amalek came to attack Israel because they were weak and vulnerable. And Jethro came rather to praise the God of Israel for all he had done for Israel. So there's a contrast there. And once again, they both give us sort of a tangible fulfillment of these promises to Abraham. cursing of those that curse thee on the one hand, and blessing those that bless thee. So Amalek and Jethro both being, again, technically speaking, Gentiles, and Amalek being cursed and Jethro being blessed and blessing. Well, then the second parallel in this account goes back into the account of Genesis. And we've talked about how there are some parallels with the accounts of the patriarchs and such. And so obviously the coming of Jethro, it has a lot of parallels, similarities with the coming of Melchizedek to Abraham after that he defeated those kings that had taken Lot. Melchizedek and Jethro, again, are both Gentiles, so to speak. And both of them praise the God of heaven and earth for his goodness to Abraham in that case and to Israel in this case. So what do we gain? Again, you have this chapter 18 that seems lengthy, this account, and features Jethro, and then he falls out of the book of Exodus at this point, and he wasn't there much to begin with. So why is he given this lengthy section? Well, Melchizedek, the writer of Hebrews, even refers, he comes without father or mother or descent. In other words, his lineage isn't traced all the way back to creation, much like all the other characters that are introduced in the book of Genesis. So he's very different. He just shows up and then he's just gone. So what's the point of adding this, or what are these parallels telling us? Well, we learn here that God certainly has a purpose for Israel. God has a purpose for Abraham back in Genesis, and then for Isaac, and then for Jacob. And he has a purpose for Israel, as we've seen that continuing now in the book of Exodus. God certainly has a purpose there. But God's purpose is not only for Israel. He declared war on Amalek. He had a purpose for them. But that doesn't mean that there's no salvation and that there's no hope for the nations. In fact, actually, it's the exact opposite. And that's what this story is telling us as well. Jethro's praise of the God, the supreme God of heaven and earth, Jethro's praise is actually the reverse of that, the hope and salvation of the nations. Well, there's hope and salvation for the nations because of God's promises to Abraham and his actions toward Israel. And that is something that I'm afraid a lot of times is missed as you come forward from Genesis and you come forward into the rest of the Bible, you even getting into the New Testament. The hope and salvation of the nations is because of God's promises to Abraham and his actions toward Israel. And that is exactly what Jethro is praising in this chapter. Now, obviously, God's purpose for the nations begins to emerge with greater clarity as you go on further through the Old Testament and even getting into the New Testament. And in the New Testament, we see those primarily Jewish early churches wrestling with this question that's raised by Gentile inclusion. Does that mean that they're now Jews? I mean, if God can save Gentiles and God can even give them the Holy Spirit without them being circumcised, does that mean that they are now Jews? Are they subjected to the old covenant and all of exactly how does this work? And we saw how that fell out. And you had one party referred to as the Judaizers, that they went one way with that, saying that yes, for Gentiles to be saved, they have to become Jews. They have to obey the old covenant law, the laws of Moses, and all of those sort of things. And then you have the other side, the true and the right side, that saw that God's purposes for the nations was from the beginning, just as it was for Israel. So even from that council in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, when James refers back to the Old Testament prophecy saying this is what has been spoken all along. So Romans, for instance, is a great letter that comes out of that and really wrestles with that particular investigation, giving the right conclusion of it all. And we can see as we read along and we come to this point in the book of Exodus, we can see it right here. Yes, God has a purpose for Israel. And because of that, all of these things are happening. All of these things are taking place. All these things are being done. All this revelation is being given. Yes, God has a purpose for Israel, but not just them. God also has a purpose for the nations. And in keeping his promise to Abraham, he's actually blessing Israel and the nations toward that day, just as was talked about in the Sunday school. All right, that's all of our message for this morning. We will close with a hymn.
How deep the Father's love.